interviewing the leading private equity executives and unlocking the secrets of success. Welcome to the Private Equity Podcast with Alex Rawlings.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Private Equity Podcast. Joining us today is Eric Stewart, an experienced private equity-backed Chief Commercial and Revenue Officer. Welcome, and thank you for sharing your insights today, Eric.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So, as we usually kick these things off, Eric, if you can give us a 60 to 90-second breakdown of you, please.
Oh, thanks, Alex. I'll kind of skip the resume and LinkedIn speak to a lot of the detail. So, I'll cover a few things that actually aren't really covered there. I mean, from a personal perspective, lived in 8 states, 2 countries. So I've spent some quality time in England, visited 44 states and 49 countries in my career. Worked and led some amazing individuals, but I've also learned along the way for some not so great leaders and individuals. So experienced in that space. Just in general, believer in hard work, solving problems, creates great luck. From a work perspective, I would describe myself first as humble, and then collaboratively decisive, a transformational leader, like to drive change. I have an incessant curiosity, which helps most of the time, and a need to measure progress and success. Throughout my career, I've definitely been very hands-on, utilize that path to really build experience and understand. From a career perspective, I actually started my career in product and process development. So with some large companies, C.R. Bard, who's now part of BD, worked for Tyco Healthcare, which became Covidien, now part of Medtronic. So started with a good operational background, but then about the first third of my career transitioned over into that commercial role. So got into marketing and sales. Really wanted to understand the customer better for a lot of things I saw. Along that career, I've managed U.S. remits, Europe, Middle East, Africa remits, and global responsibilities. I've worked for some Fortune 500, so I mentioned Covidien, which was Tyco Healthcare. I've worked for Danaher organization. I've worked in a startup of 5, so I have been marketing, sales, and about 5 other things. And I've worked in SME organizations, public, private, and PE-backed. So I've seen, a fair perspective of the market, and then really my recent love of what I've been doing in the last part of my career and keep looking forward to is those small to medium-sized enterprises that are PE or VC backed. I love the ability to get involved, roll your sleeves up and just see immediate result.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing. So what's one mistake that you see either private equity firms or their portfolio companies making, and what actions would you suggest to correct them?
It's always a great question. What mistakes? Who am I to call a mistake? What I will say is I'll give a view. I'm sure some will agree, some will disagree. And really, I don't see it as a mistake. I see it more as an undervalued priority. And really what that is what is the need within a PE-backed portfolio company to drive cultural change or cultural shift early in the process to achieve the ROI they're looking to achieve? Organizations that typically become involved with PE, they've achieved a plateau of success with a current mindset and resources. PE firms, operate very different. They provide capital to accelerate that process, but what they're looking for is that solid return, and that's an expectation to have it quick. These mindsets sometimes tend to counter the culture of what got that company to that initial plateau of success. So to me, the PE culture needs to be focused. It needs to be on discrete deliverables, efficiency metrics, based on how the operations, and a lot of times that can be very different from the mentality that got that company to being PE backed. So, really, I kind of see it as that, that PE firm needing to really reflect on that. And is that a key part of the change they need to drive early in the process?
Excellent. And you mentioned earlier in your opening gambit that experienced sales and commercial leader. What advice would you give to PE-backed companies to support them in growing and developing, obviously, revenue?
I think the first piece I would give there is one is, do you have defined set of priorities to grow that business? A lot of companies that have gotten to that point or that plateau of success, tend to be very agile, but not always the most focused. You try 5 different things, something sticks, you drive that for a while until you find another idea, you try 5 more things. Once you enter that PE phase, you're really looking at ROI. You're looking at EBITDA and ROI, straightforward. So it's making sure first that you've got those defined priorities nailed down to 2 or 3. You're laser focused on those, and you're driving all of your business activities in achieving that. And the second piece is really, from a core commercial perspective, looking at the structure of your commercial teams and looking at the operational structure. And what I mean by that is not just headcount, but do you have processes in place to drive commercial success? Spending time in Danaher companies are very focused on process. And in the commercial piece, it's really, do you have a funnel? Do you have a sales process? Do you have the basic metrics? And, sales is a lagging indicator. Do you have leading indicators that are telling you you're going to make your number? Is your marketing aligned with driving leads, driving that lead generation process, bringing value to the sales team, speaking value to your customer base before you're even engaging from a sales perspective? Do you have those systems in place, those processes in place, and making sure that you're driving those? And if you don't, that to me needs to be a critical focus on making sure that you're getting those in place first and foremost to be able to ramp up that level of success as you're achieving on your initial priorities.
Makes sense. And you mentioned obviously the leading lagging indicators and that kind of sales process. What's some of the things that you see in some of the smaller businesses that you've worked in, if we kind of look at low middle market, that would be a simple fix to implement if I came into a low middle market, first time a private equity owned business, this is probably one of the bits and pieces that most of these companies are missing. What would be kind of one of those things, do you think?
Really, I start with a CRM. Do you have a CRM in place? That's, it's a fundamental tool. Second piece, how is that established? Do you have a sales process? Is your sales process there? Is it being followed? And then really I build off of that. Is your sales process a internal business focused sales process, or is it really a customer focused sales process? And what I mean by customer focus is understanding what is your customer's buying cycle, and then making sure that your sales process reflects their cycle, not that you're trying to drive them through yours. Makes it a lot more efficient, in the course of tracking sales. That's really the core basic set of tools. Then from there, it's really just operational. Do you have regular reviews all the way down to the ground level, all the way up to C-level? You should have C-level people sitting in on your individual sales reviews. Those reviews should be weekly. Do your metrics and output support weekly cadence of activities? You can get as pedantic as number of calls in a week if you have to, but you should have some metrics that show activity, show progress, show that your sales funnel is progressing. So you can look at sales funnel velocities. You can look at time to close between stages, time to close from acquisition to sale. All of those things are good leading indicators that ultimately lead to your lagging, which is, okay, are you making your number? What is your percentage close rate, close to win rate? So going in as a PE organization, looking at the commercial structure operationally, do they do that? Do they have those tools? Are they in place? And if not, do they have the capabilities or the resources in-house to get those in place quickly? Because that is your initial measure of success to tell you, are you going to achieve your longer term, but also tell you, as you're making changes, driving different activities, driving different priorities or different market approaches, are you succeeding or failing early on, not getting that answer 6 to 12 months down the road and chewing up half a year to a year?
I completely agree with that. I think looking at the metric side of things and being able to predict future revenues on the back of it. I've spoken to so many people like, you can't do that. It's just a game of chance and a game of law of averages. And I was like, well, if it's law of averages, then the numbers need to be there and then you can see it running through. And it's something we're big on here. And a lot of the good to great kind of private equity backed businesses implement that, and they can see how many bids that they've put out, and therefore they'll predict how many they're going to win, 1 in 3, 1 in 5. So therefore they can increase churn, they can run the headcount through it, they can push sales guys on the basis of numbers to hit commission bonuses, etc. from there. And it's absolutely critical. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add to that, and this is usually in some of the organizations I've worked with, it's definitely missed. One of the organizations I've worked with as a PE back, they actually did a great job and it helped drive to a really successful exit for us, is looking at the marketing element of that. And that is specifically digital. Are you driving digital? In this day and age, 5 years ago, digital, and from a marketing perspective, everybody saw it as, well, that's a J&J Medtronic kind of thing. In this day and age, you can drive digital off of a group of one. It's having the basic tools in place, working with a good CRM, a good back-end marketing piece, tying it into a website, and then making sure that you have a way to capture visibility, either customers trying to engage with you, either softly, meaning clicks on your websites, downloading of certain activities, all the way through to specifically driving content to them that is value add, but not sales oriented. So you're actually giving to the customer so that when the customer is ready to engage, they know who you are, they know the value that you're adding, and the sales process becomes a lot simpler when you're finally engaging with them.
Absolutely. A great deal of private equity firms that I speak to, Eric, love profiles from what's regarded as world-class companies. Now, you mentioned earlier Danaher, which is always a name that if somebody goes, we'd like somebody who's come from background of Danaher or et cetera, from there. What were your big you've already mentioned one of them, but what were your kind of big takeaways from your time in that business?
Great question. There's so many takeaways. I think big takeaways in relation to private equity. One is pace. Danaher moves at a pace, and not everybody's going to succeed at Danaher. You need to be able to operate at a pace. The joke we always had in our Danaher groups was, your first job is your first few weeks. You're going to have a second job as a Danaher employee. Just accept it. So, it is that pace. The second takeaway really was, and I'm going to quote Larry Culp, and if you look at what he's doing at GE now, it's not too dissimilar what he did when he started Danaher, and it's common sense rigorously applied. And what they've done is they've taken a bunch of different common sense things and they've really put them into easy to implement tools. This is part of the Danaher business system. They give you a lot of different tools to operate with, how to do things. But if you strip all of that back, they just had core fundamental tools. And it's a base set of tools. And it was problem solving, taking things down to a transactional level, the basics of 5S, getting things in the right place, getting them sorted, getting those basic, easy things, eliminating waste. If you implement just that, as a private equity organization, you're already accelerating to your ROI, because again, most of the organizations that enter into a private equity situation may have some of these, but don't typically have that mindset because they're coming from a different mindset. So people from Danaher organizations or some of those things that have really focused and made lean a core piece of how they operate are great from a private equity standpoint, because private equity is two things. It is accelerating sales, but it's also EBITDA. It's about doing it efficiently. And most of the companies that I've dealt with or gone into that entered into private equity are ripe for just making easy, efficient moves that you can save on the bottom line without having to throw money at the problem, versus throwing a mind at the problem. And that's a key takeaway for me coming from a Danaher organization that you can apply anywhere. And I really think the last piece from a Danaher organization is being flexible. I've had roles where I've gone in, my time with BioCare, for instance, I started as the head of BD and partnership, very commercial orientation. 6 weeks in, I took over R&D because we needed to get process in place. We needed to get the team moving in the right direction. I had an engineering background, early in my career, let's call it really early in my career, that, I had to dust off. But working in companies like Danaher companies where you have to be flexible, where you tend to take multiple roles, it gets you ready for that private equity environment that change is going to come on a regular basis, and you can't always throw money at the problem. You're going to have to throw, smarts or resources at it. So having a team that's able to pick up, adjust quickly, make those changes, and Danaher definitely prepares their employees for those kind of operating roles.
You mentioned the eliminating waste, which is a area that's probably too regarded in private equity. The old days, or the old guard that was seen as private equity comes in, makes loads of people redundant, financial engineering, business gets sold, increase EBITDA, which hopefully is now gone. What would you recommend for businesses to look at with that understanding of lean principles for them to drive effective cost-cutting processes? What are some of the things that either you've implemented or you would recommend that business leaders look at within their own businesses?
I think when I look at the 8 key wastes, probably the one I would say the most from a private equity standpoint is utilizing internal knowledge. A lot of organizations getting to that point, either they usually take one or two routes. If they've got a good investment pool, they'll throw cash at a problem. Mm-hmm. Second is really, we'll just make it happen, but we're not really going to put a process around it. And really, your processes are your people. They're there. They're just not written out. So you have a lot of good resource knowledge in-house. So when you start facing some of those problems, you want to drive efficiency. It's really about starting from the ground level up and saying, okay, how do you do this? And, it gets into mapping it out, which then starts driving to the other key wastes. Okay, do you have over processing? Do you have too much motion in the process? Do you have a good supply, push-pull? And I'm speaking more operationally, but even commercially, what's my windshield time? What's my sales call cadence of visiting customers? Am I doing those things efficient? But it's just starting with utilizing your people, getting the process diagrammed out, which tends to lead into every other process. And then it's diving into the process and then making it more efficient. And I think my advice to private equities in that aspect is make it a focus for your portfolio company that you need to do this. This is a priority. And we talk a lot about different priorities when I look at things that, earlier we talked about what's the key mistake. Well, one of those pieces is when you set those priorities, as we discussed, one of those priorities needs to be for your organization to drive lean activity. And that takes time. It's one of my favorite diagrams is the diagram of the two people pushing the cart with square wheels and somebody with a round wheel going, hey, I can help you. Like, nope, we're too busy. You've got to take that time out, stop, and it's got to be a priority to make that happen. So it's utilizing that key knowledge to untap and uncover all the other waste, and then just giving people the time to tackle those wastes and make the changes they need. That drives so much bottom line without having to throw a ton of cash at it. It's amazing.
Sorry to interrupt here. Just a quick note to highlight our new sponsor, Grata. The private equity market is rapidly shifting to a data-driven, proprietary deal sourcing standard. Grata provides the window into over 7 million middle market private companies. Contact Grata so you can access the market first. Request a demo at www.grata.com. Now back to the podcast. Yeah, there's a great book called Work the System. His first name's Sam, and I can't remember the surname. I think it's Sam, or at least Sam runs the business now. But there's something that we've implemented here is that process and looking and following their or kind of automate, delegate, delete type process, especially off my table. So completely agree with that.
Yeah, I've done start, stop, and continue activities, similar things. It's, walk in, what are you doing that you need to continue to do, and what are you doing that should get better? And then the hardest question, but the most urgent question is, what are you going to stop doing? Why are you doing this? And just stop doing it.
Yeah, it's creating that, especially with creating those systems where people can come into your business and begin to train and learn and develop without taking huge people time intensity, but also making that engaging and process led, where it's what I regard as the bulk of it is trained via an online platform using audio kinetic. using audio visual type learning, but then also being able to have like a manager as a block and tackler to answer the kind of questions, whereas the processes were already let out and you're not asking, oh, how do you use this system? Well, here's the video, you follow it step by step kind of process. So yeah, all that kind of stuff's absolutely essential and so regularly missed because we're all too busy, chasing the next bit of revenue, growing the business and going after what we've got as the big things. Whereas some of those small steps get changed. It makes the whole process smoother and able for growth quicker.
As I say, too busy pushing that wagon to stop and change the wheels.
Absolutely. We haven't spoken too much about your kind of healthcare, life sciences, medical, pharma type background, and I say that because we all interpret different areas of let's call it the healthcare spectrum under one. One of the areas I did want to talk about is because we do a great deal of searches in this space, and it's really interesting and ever kind of further invested private equity space. What are you seeing at the moment in the kind of CDMO market?
It's amazing. I've seen a lot of activity probably in the last 4 to 5 years in the CDMO space. My history, I spent some time in 2 different CDMOs, specifically focused more in the diagnostics, but both of those CDMOs did work outside of diagnostics. One of them did, med device as well. One of them actually did stuff that was not even healthcare related. It kind of touched a bit of a lot of different things, but recent activities transitioning out of CDMO back into the direct piece. I utilize CDMOs in a small to medium sized business that was private equity backed, and it was heavily encouraged by our private equity investors because when you're starting to look at things like product development, especially in the diagnostic space, you're getting into some pretty heavy technical areas. So, microfluidics, optics, laser, unless you've got those resources in house, they're hard to find. They're very expensive. And if you're looking to get into a new space or adjacent space, once you've gotten into that space, you're strapped with some pretty heavy expenses. So you're forced to make some tough decisions. Getting into the CDMO space allows you to tap all of those resources, some of the best resources in the world, very quickly. It's an expense, so it's not a capital cost, which you can justify a lot easier. That allowed us to look at that, and also from a manufacturing standpoint, we had certain situations in a company where we're growing so quick in our core business that we're actually squeezing ourselves out of manufacturing space for our secondary business. You're forced to either, again, drop a bunch of capital to create new manufacturing space, or in this case, you can outsource it. And you can outsource it at an expense. You're not having to carry the capital costs, and it was great. So, there's that activity from personal experience, but even watching the market, having friends in both spaces now, I've seen several actions of late in larger private equities. They're actually snapping up CDMOs. And in some cases, they're just they're managing them directly as a portfolio. In other cases, there's been some recent activity where certain private equities are actually grabbing a CDMO, they're grabbing a contract research organization, they're grabbing a diagnostics company, and they're actually creating, whether they create an actual company or they just sit them together within a sub portfolio so that they can interact and coexist much better and more efficiently. There's a lot of that activity happening, and it's been pretty interesting to watch because they're tackling the future of what the diagnostic market needs, which is advanced diagnostics, getting closer to the patient point of care. And instead of waiting for one big company to get through that long pipeline, they're going to put 3 small companies together and say, okay, you 3 figure it out together. And then we can work from there, whether they sell it part and parcel or whether they just continue to invest and collapse it under one name. It's their choice at that point. So it's been pretty interesting to watch in the last, let's call it 3 or 4 years, that level of activity picking up.
Definitely we're seeing heavy investment in that arena. So coming from a commercial sales perspective, always interested to know, what 3 attributes do you believe make a top performer?
Great question. I'm going through different things, and I'm actually going to utilize I think it's another one of your guests, Paul Doyle, said the same thing. And everybody has their own list. So this is my list. Really, for me, first, it's humility. You go back to the Michael Jordan quote. Superstars win games, but teams win championships. And in order, you've got to be. Humility is the act of being a human. You need to be able to relate to people. They need to be able to relate to you. So humility also gives you ability to make mistakes. Focus on the greater good, not just yourself. So that to me is my number one key metric. The second is actually metrics focused. Again, I'm going to steal another quote, but Peter Drucker, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. It's the only way you're going to improve. People say, oh, it's a 1% improvement. That's improvement. It's better than zero. So if you're measuring it, you know where you are, you know where you're trying to go. It shows success and failure. And to me, failure is a learning event. It's not a person. It's a way to know that something doesn't work. So using measurement can be a learning process for you, or sometimes it just be the kick up the backside you need to kind of take it to the next level to drive more momentum. The third for me really is customer focused. And this, I think it started in my operations days. And in commercial, you talk customer focused. Everybody says, yeah, I get it. But really, I don't speak about customer focused in terms of teams in relation to commercial. It's really focused on everyone. So my question to anybody I'm working with and I'm dealing with, who is your customer? What are the things you're doing in your day that is delivering something to somebody? The customer can be you. It can be your work colleagues. It can be the recipient of the customer, the company's actions. But at the end of the day, you have to know who that person is. And then you have to have a true understanding of what their need is, because if you do, it almost guarantees success. That deep understanding helps you set realistic expectations and be efficient in delivering them, because you know what they need. I mean, how many times have we received something that you say, yeah, okay, this is supposed to do this, but it doesn't really do what I need. I'll figure out a different way. So, that is my third piece, and being really a top performer is being customer focused. So when I summarize, humility, be a human, measure what you're doing to improve, and understand what your customer really needs, and then go deliver that.
Love those. What do you love about the private equity industry, and equally, what do you dislike about it?
Love is a bit easier. I love the speed of private equity, the speed of change. Private equity puts a very defined time limit on expected return. I've worked in public companies, and you're chasing the earnings per share, and you're chasing numbers, but it didn't happen this quarter, can happen next quarter. Private equity is very defined. I like the focus of private equity in the small to medium sized space. Now, obviously, there's larger deals, there's very small deals, but there's a lot of activity in the SME space, and to me, that's where true growth can happen at a rapid pace. I've working in larger companies, you can get growth, but it takes forever. And the analogy I always use is, it's not a tanker ship, it's a speedboat. Trying to turn a business in Medtronic is more like a tanker ship. It's a very wide turn, but you can get there. And if you turn it too hard, you'll lose some deck chairs. Another love of private equity really is it helps great business ideas accelerate in the market against an 800-pound gorilla. And a lot of times you can do it under the radar, which is great because you're not having to deal with that competitive pressure. One of the organizations I've worked with, we were the fourth largest player, but there was a chasm between the three and us. And by time the top three players figured out we were stealing their business, it was too late. We had such great returns, and it was all under the radar, but private equity helped us get there fast. And then the last piece, we talked a bit earlier about that CDMO space. It's the collaboration opportunities within the complementary PE portfolio companies. I worked with a great private equity in one of my companies, and they were constantly in board meetings asking us, hey, what do you need? We'd say, oh, we're working on this. I'd say, hey, actually, we've got a portfolio company over here that can help you with this. Let us get you connected. They'd connect us. We'd take off. We'd go. Trying to do that in a larger company, it's a lot of conversation, a lot of back and forth, a lot of, are you competing against me? Are you not? Here, it's just pretty straightforward. The dislikes. really I'm going to come up with a couple. I mean, one, and this isn't every private equity company, but working in that space, having friends that work in that space, you hear war stories too. It's unrealistic expectation. You're always going to push, and we had a saying at Danaher, it's a fine line between stress and strain. And working with private equity is really making sure they understand the market dynamics and the realistic understanding of what needs to happen inside the organization. There should always be stress, but understanding where that strain is and knowing when to back up sometimes that, okay, you're going to break it. I think the second piece is, and again, not me personally, I haven't had to experience it yet, which is great, but I've heard the war stories of integration into organizations. Some PE firms will feel, okay, we need to come in and direct manage. We need to tell you how to run this business. They can offer a lot of great insight, but unless you're in the day-to-day, it is hard sometimes to understand the mechanics. So, finding that fine line between helping drive change, helping be a part of change, but then letting people change for the sake of change. And really, I say that it's empowering leadership to drive the change, or changing management so that you have the right people to drive that change. And then the last piece kind of ties in with that. It's the polar opposite. It's the managing hope. Managing hope to me is sticking with the leadership team and hoping they're going to get it and change. Initially, a lot of PEs that I've talked with and worked with, or people I know that have worked with, they'll talk about wanting to limit the distraction of change. Especially as you make the acquisition, you're moving forward, which is understandable. But at some point, you've got to look at, okay, is there ever going to be an alignment? Is the organization going to get there to get that alignment? And if not, you got to just rip the Band-Aid off. You got to make the change and do it. So, finding the fine line between those two. I think those are the main things that I would say from a dislike standpoint that I could really think about.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think the second point, dislike with regards to, that kind of overbearing nature of private equity to get involved. I think some of the best private equity investors genuinely realize they are investors. They are not business owners, business runners. They're not operators, probably for a better phrase there. But I think that's where the operating partner role has benefited heavily, where the PE firm feels a little bit more in control with the expertise sitting in the PE firm, as well as helping the portfolio companies. I think that's certainly benefited the industry. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think my red flag on that one is when you're talking with a potential partner as PE and they're saying, oh, we've done 3 of these we got a great way for you to do this. It's okay, let's dig into that. And I was blessed, and one of the private equities I worked in was a great private equity. We updated them regularly. It got to the point where when we get on calls, they would just ask us, do you need anything from us, or do you need more cash to make that happen faster? And a lot of times we said, no, we're going to throw some brains at this first before we come back and ask for cash. And, they'd follow up. Did you solve it? Yes, we did. Okay, great. And that was a blessing. It was the right level of what we needed to be successful as a whole.
Let's get a good C-suite team in place. What are your influences, Eric? What do you read, watch, listen? What would you recommend that others check out?
I'm a bit of old school when it comes to that. I do a lot of reading still. It's one of the few things, and I'm a hard book guy. I can't read on computer screens. I think I look at enough computers as it is. So I like that. Yeah, and my reading tends to be very diverse. I like to touch a lot of things. I go back to that incessant curiosity. So I'll give you the last 3 things I've read, or 2, and I'm reading the third. The last 3 things I read, actually, and I saw you had, and it's not a shameless plug at all, is because I love some of the stuff that you guys have done. Adam Coffey, and I know you guys interviewed him. Adam Coffey's Private Equity Playbook. I mean, it went back to Danaher concepts for me of common sense. It's laid out very nicely. It's very well explained, and I thought it was a great book. Second thing I read was, don't know if you may know this, may not, Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. If you need to motivate to run through a wall, it's a great book to read because he will want you to do that. But it's a good story, good motivation, kind of, again, a bit of my own kick in the pants. It's okay. This is great. And then the third one I'm reading right now is more theological. It's The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. So just, rounding out that incessant curiosity. So those are things that, I'm reading right now. Like I said, my reading is pretty diverse. Podcast wise, I've gotten into recently, started listening to more podcasts. I've been listening to a lot of the McKinsey podcasts. There's some good stuff in there, and there's a ton of content. So me personally, I've got to sift through it. Okay, is this going to be really relevant for me? Is it not? I've learned a couple of good things on there. When you start getting into, things like diversity and inclusion, or, environmental governance, sustainability type stuff. They've got some great stuff that I haven't been around some of that at a big level to really gain. So you can gain some quick knowledge there. And then the other thing, again, definitely not a shameless plug, I've really just enjoyed the content and the interviews, is some of the raw selection interviews. It's been great content. Just listening to different thought leaders out there and their perspectives has been really good. Outside of that, I think the only other thing, I tend to gravitate from time to time to out-of-box thinkers. One of my favorites that I could mention, and I've read most of his stuff, and I'll watch different blogs or different posts and sites, is Richard Branson. A completely different focus to business, but going back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, that customer focus. Focusing 100% on your customer, but also on your team. Making sure that you're doing right by your team. They will make your customers right. But just his approach to things is not always that standard business approach. It's, you just flip it on its head, look at it in a different way, and you'll find some great solutions to it. So, he's one of several out-of-box thinkers I like to just kind of watch from time to time and dive in and dive out when I see good content.
Excellent. Quite the journey there. Adam Coffey, David Goggins through to Richard Branson. Yeah, we've got so obviously Adam Coffey been on the podcast twice, shared his story for both mergers and acquisitions, then driving through to exit, which is both of his books that he's written. And then David Goggins, funnily enough, we've actually got a framed book of David Goggins on the wall. He's one of our values as a business, which is mindset, which we strongly believe that that's a key area for it. So yeah, interesting. And then through to obviously a very famous Brit of Richard Branson, and obviously Virgin Airlines and what he's done there. But fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing that, Eric. If anybody wants to reach out post this podcast, how best do they do so, please?
Best, easiest way, just find me on LinkedIn. It's Eric Stewart, and you just feel free to drop me a message and be more than happy to talk. One of the things I enjoy doing in my background is just connecting people with other people, or, unique problems, and saying, hey, have you tried this? Have you thought about that? Or talk to this person. So, don't be shy. Don't be bashful. Just feel free to reach out in a message, and happy to help.
Perfect. Excellent. And we'll put that in the show notes as always. So, well, thank you very much for joining us, Eric. I really appreciate your insight, looking at the commercial side of things, dip into the CDMO world, and looking a little bit into the old brand name of Danaher as well. So thank you very much for everything you've shared today.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation and look forward to following you guys as we go forward, and best of luck to you and the team as well.
Absolutely. And also thanks for the plug on the podcast, which, as always, for those listening, thank you very much for joining us. Should you ever need support with your hiring for your private equity firms or your portfolio executives across Europe and North America, please do reach out to us here at Raw Selection. And if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe, and you'll be notified of the next podcast, which comes out every 2 weeks. But till the next time, keep smashing it. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Private Equity Podcast on www.raw-selection.com.